On the coldest night of the year, when the sky spilled snow like sifted flour and the world went quiet beneath its hush, a goat named Clementine curled beside a fireplace and exhaled a sigh too heavy for an ordinary animal. She wasn't supposed to be there. Not in the living room. Not on the braided rug between two aging golden retrievers. And certainly not wearing a red dog collar with a name tag that clinked when she stirred. Outside, the barn stood frosted and still. Her herd, distant in more than distance, slept huddled in straw. But Clementine, with cloven hooves and gentle eyes, waited faithfully by the door that no one told her to watch. Every night as the embers settled and shadows stretched along the wooden floors, she resumed her post near the hearth. Not because she was cold, not because she was lonely, but as if something were unfinished. As if someone she loved had simply stepped out and forgotten to return. The hawthorns rarely spoke of it outright. Only in glances, brief smiles, or in the way Emma might pause on the stairs to glance into the flickering room below. As though listening for a paw step, or a hoof. To look at her, you wouldn't think Clementine was different. Just a pale, stocky goat with a tuft of auburn along her spine. Yet those who spent a winter under the same roof could swear otherwise. She barked, you see. Not loud, not real, but mimicked, in her own odd way. She came when called, wagged her tail, or tried. Followed routines meant for golden retrievers, not livestock. They said perhaps she'd gone peculiar, spending too much time indoors among the dogs. But that explanation always fell short. Because Clementine didn't just imitate the dogs. She believed she was one. And belief, as anyone who's loved deeply can tell you, has a curious way of making itself real. So here, on this quiet night of snowfall and glowing logs, Clementine waited with purpose. Ears tilted, eyes half-lidded, yet alert. Her breath a soft fog. A sentinel spirit in hoofed form, guarding something invisible. And somewhere, in the calming creak of timber and wind curling past the chimney, there lingered a whisper of a question that would take a full year to answer. What makes a creature choose love over instinct? And what makes her wait, even when no one comes home? Let me take you back, before the fireplace, before the sigh that unsettled the air, to a spring storm, a trembling life, and the first quiet heartbeat of a story that doesn't quite belong to this world. Rain sang gently on the barn roof that night, a slow rhythm of water brushing pitched tin. The scent of hay, damp earth, and something sharp, like lightning held too long, hung in the air. The nanny goat lay trembling in the straw, her flanks heaving, eyes darting to shadows that didn't move. It was Emma who found her, flashlight trembling in hand. She'd noticed the nanny lagging earlier, uneasy and restless near the feeding trough. Now the storm had fully arrived, wind cracking branches, rafters creaking, and in that flickering beam of light, a tiny shape glistened, slick with birth, barely stirring. 2 hooves, a quiet gasp, then stillness. Emma fell to her knees, her cheeks wet from rain or maybe something else, and gently pulled the kid forward. The nanny made no move to help. No licking, no nuzzle. Just turned her face away, as though trying to forget the cold shape at her feet. The kid was too small. Far too still. Wrapped in Emma's faded flannel jacket, the creature barely made a sound. Its breath, if it could be called that, was so light it might have been imagined. Yet in the curve of her palm, the goat's heart stammered once, then again. The barn smelled of endings, of storm-drenched soil and surrender. But Emma, still kneeling, pulled the bundle close to her chest and whispered something no one else heard. Maybe a prayer, maybe a promise. She didn't bring the baby goat to the stall with the heat lamp, nor to the kitchen with the cat crate and towels. She brought her to the den, where the fire still held amber coals, and laid her beside the youngest golden retriever, Scout. Scout lifted his head, nudged the damp little thing with his snout. A soft whine escaped his throat, almost question-like. Emma settled the goat in a swath of flannel beside him and placed her hand on both of their backs. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. "She'll need you," Emma told Scout. Scout didn't move, only curled tighter against the little body beside him and closed his eyes. In the morning, the rain had drifted into drizzle. The world outside was gray and glistening. And in the den, the flannel warbled slightly. A sound, small, frail, but defiant in its place. A bleat like the breath of a candle refusing to leave the air. Clementine had survived the night. When she tried to stand, her legs gave out. But Scout nudged her upright. She stumbled, toppled, climbed onto his side like a clumsy cub. When he began to stretch, she followed him, hoofs clacking softly on the floor. Emma, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, peered in the doorway and blinked. "I didn't think, I wasn't sure she'd." But Clementine blinked up at her and wagged the end of her short tail. Not quite joy, not quite understanding, but something just as real. Emma couldn't help it. She laughed. And in that laugh, a choice was quietly made. A choice older than instinct, yet tender as touch. To raise the goat indoors. Not until she grew stronger. Not until she learned to eat on her own. But until, well, until it no longer made sense to do otherwise. For the first few weeks, Clementine remained curled on flannel beside Scout, wobbling on uncertain legs, needing help to stand, to feed, to find her place in a room made for paws rather than hooves. But slowly, subtly, she began to move with more confidence. First to follow Scout across the room. Then to nuzzle her head under Emma's hand when the teen sat cross-legged beside the fire. She drank from a bowl like the dogs, their reflection mirrored in hers. She stood on the couch, clumsier, certainly, but no less determined. She slept in the sunspots on the carpet and bleated sharply if left alone. It didn't take long before she trotted when called. When Emma sang softly in the evenings, brushing the dogs' coats into soft piles on the porch, Clementine would appear, shoulder first through the screen door, a low bleat accompanying each step, as if adding her own verse to the twilight ritual. Soon, the slipper thefts began. At first, it was an accident, Emma insisted, Clementine gripping the woolen shape because it reminded her of flannel. But then came the tennis balls, inexplicably appearing in the goat's bedding, alongside chewed sticks and one plastic squeaker robbed from beneath the couch. Emma tried to scold her, gently, but Clementine only looked back with such open honesty, ears tilted, tail twitching in dog-like rhythm, that the room dissolved into laughter. "She barks better than she bleats," Emma's older brother Dylan remarked one afternoon, raising an eyebrow as Clementine ran after his shoe. Teeth to the laces, the retrievers cheering her on with barks. It became a household game. Scout would play fetch. Clementine would chase him. The older dog Maple tolerated her with grandmotherly patience, while the youngest pup, Tilly, tried to herd her through the back hallway with intermittent yaps. The result was more a parade than a game, often ending when Clementine had butted the pantry door in excitement or leapt onto the ottoman with scandalous goat pride. But no one seemed to mind. One morning, Emma did something small, but not insignificant. Between bites of peanut butter toast and homework on the counter, she reached across the drawer where the dog's collars were kept. She held a small red one, leather, meant for a terrier they'd once fostered, and walked over to Clementine, who was lying on the couch beside Scout. "Too big," Emma muttered with a frown as she slipped it around the goat's neck. It dangled past her shoulders. But later that day, with a hole punched clean through the leather and a tiny brass tag attached with care, the collar fit snugly around Clementine's broad neck. Clem, it read. Simple, honest. When Emma whispered the name, tentative as a question, Clementine turned her head sharply, ears up. She bleated, once, then leaned into the girl's palm. And that night, after the dishes had been washed and the sky drawn in grays and navy, Clementine curled not beside Scout's flank, but directly on the dog's doormat, nestled comfortably in the groove they left when waiting for walks. The fire cast golden patterns across her back. Her breath was steady, the collar glinted. Outside, it began to rain again, soft and rhythmic, like a memory returning without words. And inside, nobody told her she didn't belong. Clementine's days fell into a gentle rhythm, full of rituals she never questioned. Morning stretches beside the fireplace. A shared breakfast with the dogs, though hers was oats in warm water, arranged neatly beside kibble bowls. And wherever Emma walked, Clementine was never more than 2 steps behind, hooves clacking softly on hardwood. There was a curious quietness to her presence. She wasn't loud or demanding, but simply there. When Emma tied her hair in the mirror, Clementine would watch. When she played the old upright piano that no one tuned anymore, Clementine would sit nearby, ears perked at every note, as if recognizing a phrase long forgotten. In the afternoons, Emma sometimes read on the porch swing, and Clementine lay across the wooden boards beneath her, the dogs scattered like driftwood between naps and half-finished games. The air would buzz with bees and the smell of wild grass, and occasionally Clementine would stand, shake herself off, and butt her nose gently against Tilly's side, starting a rumpus that ended with them tangled in porch cushions. But one evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the sky in colors only July can hold, something shifted. Emma stepped outside with a small box in her hands, light blue, scuffed at the edges, smelling faintly of cedar and dust. It held collars, ones not worn anymore, leather softened with memory and brass tags dulled with time. Emma sat cross-legged in the grass and held them like old photographs, remembering the dogs who came before. There was Jasper's, whose tail had thumped like thunder. Willow's, shy and watchful. And now Scout's, still faintly smelling of pine and fireplace smoke. Clementine nudged her arm gently, puzzled perhaps by the silence. Emma turned, eyes damp, and gave a half-smile with no words behind it. Then, very slowly, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a new brass tag, plain and precisely cut. On one side, Clem. On the other, if found, returned to Emma. She didn't cry, not exactly, but there was a hush around the gesture, a reverence, as if naming something makes it not only known, but real. The collar already circled Clementine's neck, worn in by weeks of wear. But the tag clicked a little louder than the others. That night, when Clementine stretched out half asleep in the den, the sound was barely louder than the fire's whisper. Emma watched her from the doorway, arms folded over the banister. "She thinks she's a dog," Dylan said from behind her, voice wrapped in a chuckle and curiosity. Emma only lifted a shoulder. "She thinks she's ours." And it was true. From that day on, the tag danced at her throat, a soft clang of belonging. When strangers visited the farm, their eyes always paused. "A goat?" they'd say. "One of the dogs," Emma would reply with a nod. And no one could argue with the picture before them. 4 shapes curled in a patch of sunlight. Clementine in the middle, breathing slow, her collar gleaming. The world stretched wide beneath a summer sky, cloudless, blue, and humming with bees. Clementine stepped into the season like she'd been waiting for it, her hoofs light across dew-slick grass, her eyes always trained on the nearest wagging tail. She joined the dogs on their adventures, through the meadow beyond the pear trees, up the rocky trails above the orchard, and down into the slow, ribboning creek where trout flashed silver in the shallows. The creek was a favorite. Scout would wade in up to his chest, the cold water easing his old joints, while Tilly barked at dragonflies and Clementine kicked up muddy splashes, alarming fish and families of ducks in equal measure. Back at the house, Emma would hose them all down, dogs sitting in sulky tolerance, while Clementine pranced under the spray like it was a ceremonial rain. Wet goats smell strange, Dylan insisted. Emma only laughed and wrapped her in the same beach towel reserved for damp retrievers. Car rides became a new adventure. The backseat of the pickup was wide enough for everyone, more or less. With windows down, dog tongues flapping, and Clementine standing with her nose in the wind. It was an odd family portrait, painted in fur, fleece, and a great many seat covers. At cookouts, Clementine sat politely at Emma's side. When picnic plates clattered to the ground, she did not lunge like Tilly or nose the fragments like Maple. She waited, as though unsure whether to take her cues from instincts or etiquette. She begged, once, with a gentle tap of her forehead against Emma's elbow. Their eyes met, and Emma, smiling, shared a corner of her cornbread. The neighborhood children came often to see her. "Can she fetch?" they'd ask. Clementine never fetched alone, but she chased the dogs who did, bleating encouragements, leaping high as the golden retrievers when tennis balls spun across the pasture. She could teach the pups a thing or two, Emma joked one day, watching Clementine nudge Tilly into sharing a long-lost chew toy retrieved from under the porch. Dylan swore Clementine had learned pack politics better than the actual dogs. She managed the hierarchy without teeth, bark, or growl. Just a quiet presence, always near, always watching. Afternoons brought long naps. 4 bodies sprawled in a heap beneath the oak tree or in a sunbeam stretching across the living room rug. Clementine curled into the warm crook between Scout and Maple. If she dreamed, it wasn't of pastures. It was of paws and porch steps, and collared hearts beating in rhythm. Up by the barn gate, tourists sometimes paused and asked, half joking, if they offered goat petting. "That's not a goat," Dylan would say. "That's Clementine." And Emma, if she heard, would nod without looking up. There were moments of trouble, of course. Like the time Clementine leapt onto the kitchen island in pursuit of a sandwich, or when she startled the mail carrier with her impressive impersonation of a barking dog from behind the curtains. But such moments passed easily, like thunderstorms on clear mornings. The mischief came wrapped in affection, impossible to scold for long. Even when she insisted on standing with her hooves in the sink to watch Emma do dishes, or when she chewed the corner off a library book titled The Canine Mind. Emma didn't mind, neither did the dogs. They had, all of them, made space without realizing it. Shifted their world slowly to account for something different, 4-legged, yes, but not the same. A goat who spoke in dog, who listened like silence, and who felt, somehow, fiercely loyal to a life she'd never been born for. The days carried on, lazy and honey-colored. Fireflies blinked through dusk and porch lights. And whatever Clementine had once been meant to be blurred gently into the background, like the hum of bees or the creak of the porch swing. She wasn't trying to be anything anymore. She simply was. Autumn crept over the hills like a soft shawl, rustling amber leaves and breathing hush into the grasses. The air changed, quieter, heavier, mornings crisp enough to fog the windows, evenings curling early into darkness. The sunshine, once gold and bold, softened at the edges and entered rooms like an unspoken thought. Clementine noticed, though no one said it aloud. She moved more slowly now, not from weakness, but from deliberation. Where once she sprinted, she now walked. Where she once bounded with the dogs, she now trailed them, content to observe, to be near without competing. The others charged ahead on hikes, but Clementine lingered at Scout's side. Scout had grown stiffer with the season. His gait was limping into something older, hips creaking as though the wind had seeped into his bones, and his naps lengthened into whole afternoons. He no longer chased tennis balls. He smelled the river and turned away. It was Clementine who noticed first, before even Emma. She trailed him gently, always just close enough to reach, but never crowding. When he laid down under the oak tree, she stood beside him until his eyes closed, then folded into the space where sun warmed the ground. She stopped taking the porch steps in a single bound. She sat when he sat. She breathed when he breathed. Emma noticed the change in silence. Clementine no longer bleated when someone knocked on the door. She no longer stole slippers. She lay at Scout's flank as though guarding something delicate, not his body, but his time. Like she could hear it ticking, none of them could. The days passed this way, slow and gentle. Apple slices fell from the trees, and Clementine learned not to chase them. Dogs barked in the distance, but she stayed put when Scout didn't answer. When the wind picked up and carried clouds across the sky, she tilted her ears and watched it in stillness, like she recognized the shift. Then came the first frost. It was thin at first, a dusting of invisible cold that turned the pasture stiff and shining. The fireplace burned longer that evening, logs snapping in the hearth as Emma tucked herself onto the rug and the dogs dropped in tired piles around her. Scout curled with a sigh at the flame's edge. Clementine did not lie beside him. She stood that night, watching. Her head low, her tail still, she seemed to weigh the air itself. Emma called to her gently, patting the spot closer to the hearth. But Clementine didn't move, not until Scout shuddered slightly in his sleep, struggling for warmth. Then, wordlessly, she stepped forward and pressed herself against him. Not beside him, but against him. He stirred, comforted, and the sigh that escaped him was quiet but deep. His breathing slowed. Her body remained statue still, her gaze locked on the dancing firelight. She didn't blink for a long, long while. Only the gentle rise of her side moved, slow and steady, tethered to Scout's rhythm. Morning broke cold and silver, sunlight scattered like frost across the hilltops. Emma padded into the room, still in sleep's shadow, rubbing her neck. The fire had dipped to embers. And there, near the hearth, the shapes remained. But only Clementine stirred. She rose stiffly, looked to Scout, nuzzled once. No response. There was no noise. Not from the dogs, not from the girl, not from the house itself. Even the birds outside seemed to pause their sunrise songs. Only the sound of Clementine's hooves, shifting ever so slightly on the rug, broke the silence. She did not bleat. She did not cry. She simply lay back down, close but not touching, and fixed her gaze on the fire. From the window, snowflakes began to drift, soft as breath. Far too soon for snow, Emma thought absently, but it fell anyway, as if the world understood something had ended. Clementine did not leave her post that day. Nor the next. She waited by the fireplace as though it still offered him warmth. As though love did not retreat with loss. The wind howled low that night, not in fury but in mourning, like the breath of old trees remembering summer. The forest behind the barn stirred with unrest, branches tapping like questions against each other. Inside the house, the fire had been rebuilt, its flames licking gently around new logs, the living room cast in its warm, flickering grasp. Scout hadn't moved much that day. His breaths were shallow, head resting at an odd angle, one paw twitching from time to time as if chasing memories in his sleep. Emma had laid a second blanket over him before heading to bed, pressing a kiss between his ears and whispering things he likely couldn't hear anymore. Still, she whispered them. Clementine stayed. She hadn't eaten since mid-morning. When Emma had offered her warm oats, she'd only sniffed, then turned away. Instead, she stood for hours, facing the flame, her side to Scout, her hooves shifting occasionally when the hearthstones pressed too sharply. Sometime after midnight, when the sky was sliced in moonlight and frost crept along the porch railings, she finally lay down. Not in her usual spot, but flush against Scout's spine, her flank rising and falling with his now shaky rhythm. Every time he shuddered, she adjusted. Every limp breath, she matched it. Like a second heartbeat, steadying the first. The other dogs, their bodies curled in instinctive distance, watched from across the room. Tilly whined once in her sleep. Maple sighed. Clementine didn't blink. She watched the fire like it contained answers. Or perhaps like it carried something away, something that flickered not with loss, but with return. In that room full of ghosts yet living, she waited, deliberate, calm, whole. By dawn, the fire had faded again. Only embers now, and soft pulses of heat curling into smoke. The world outside was coated in frost, pale gray and delicate, as if grief had left fingerprints on the earth. Emma found them like that. One still, one breathing. Clementine stood as she entered, slowly, legs stiff, body heavy, a kind of slow reverence in every motion. She turned to Emma, eyes unreadable. Then to Scout. She lowered her head. Her muzzle brushed his fur once, and then again. When it was clear he would not stir, she stepped backward, just enough to sit, to stay. Not as a dog might keep vigil, but as something deeper. As if promising to remember what needed remembering. Emma knelt beside them. Her hands were shaking, but no words came. The room held its breath. Time folded inward, and among the silence, a shape remained. A girl, a goat, and the echo of one final night's peace. The days after were too quiet. Not in the way silence usually sits when a storm passes, but in the way absence makes a sound of its own. Clementine did not run when the back door creaked open. She did not toss her head when the wind tousled the curtains. She only waited, always just on the edge of something. Thresholds, windows, the edge of the rug where Scout once slept. The other dogs returned to rhythm. Slowly, circled into their naps again, barked into the evening light, fetched tennis balls with half-hearted joy. But Clementine stayed by the hearth. Emma left the fire going long after it was needed. She refilled the kindling basket twice a day, not for warmth, but for presence. For continuity, for the place where Scout had last been himself. Each night, after the house quieted and the news had been shut off mid-sentence and the dishes dried in silence, Clementine took her place beside the hearth. She lay curled, ears still, eyes open longer than sleep allowed. She did not look to Emma when footsteps crossed the room. She just waited. Dylan asked, once, "Do you think she knows?" Emma didn't answer. Not fully. Only looked down at the goat whose collar still bore the weight of devotion and said, "I think. She misses him the same way I do." Clementine didn't eat well. Oats went untouched some mornings. Emma tried apples, molasses, even cornbread, the favorite from summer afternoons. Clementine would chew slowly, mechanically, as if feeding a body while her soul waited elsewhere. The red collar dulled at the edges. The tag clinked less often. Movement slowed inside her, not from illness, but from watching. Always watching. The fire, the door, the barn path slick with leaves. Sometimes, late at night, Emma would come downstairs, unable to sleep, pacing memories she couldn't shelve. She'd find Clementine sitting upright, not asleep, not restless, just there. Facing the fireplace, like a statue carved from quiet. Still keeping watch? Emma whispered once. The goat didn't look up, but her ears turned, faintly, toward the voice. Like a secret language passed between them. One morning, after the first snow had melted into slush, Emma opened the front door to let in the pale sunrise. The yard was mud-striped and freezing. Frost clung to the fence posts. Clementine stood just behind her, gaze trained toward the woods. Emma followed it. Nothing but trees. Quiet. Still. Clementine returned to the hearth. She never bleated. Not since Scout passed. But every so often, in the lull between log pops and settling dust, Emma could swear, just barely, that she heard the catch of breath that was not her own. She'd pause, wait, but it was always Clementine again, laying her chin on the rug, eyes flickering in firelight, as though listening for a step that never came. And each night, the fire was lit anew. Not to warm the room, but to keep something remembered from fading. The wind returned with a sharpness that night, louder than before, pulling at shutters, whistling down chimneys, lifting dry leaves in rustling spirals across the gravel walk. Rain hadn't yet begun, but the sky promised it with a low, humming pressure that made the dogs restless and the light bulbs flicker once, then settle. Inside, the fire cracked against the storm's breath. Emma moved quietly through the house, securing latches, whispering comfort to Tilly, who disliked wind more than thunder. Dylan texted that the roads might flood again come morning. Maple had already retreated to her corner under the stairs. Only Clementine remained unmoved, exactly where she'd been the night before, and the night before that. On the hearth rug, gaze steady. Then, just past midnight, something shifted. A sound that wasn't wind. A pause in the rhythm. A silence that pressed in, muffled everything else. Clementine stood. Not quickly, not alarmed, but with intention. Her head tilted, ears razor straight. Her hoofs clacked softly against the tiles as she stepped toward the front door. Emma glanced up from the couch, surprised. Clem? But Clementine was already moving. She didn't wait to be let out. With surprising force, her head butted the door. Once. Enough to startle the latch. It didn't open, but it shuddered in its frame. Emma stood and grabbed her coat. Hang on, you can't go out in this. Too late. Clementine turned, headed toward the mudroom, then pawed once at the side door there. Emma followed. Are you hearing something I'm not? When the door opened, the cold slapped their faces. Clementine stepped into the wind with a certainty no one could name. Not fear, not curiosity, a compulsion rooted deeper than thought. She crossed the yard at a quick trot, not toward the barn or pasture, but past the fence, toward the tree line that bordered the back acres. Her hoofs were sure despite the slick grass and the snapping branches above. Emma pulled on boots without socks, called after her. Clementine, hey, but Clementine didn't pause. Emma grabbed a flashlight and coat, muttered, you're not doing this alone, and followed. She half expected to find a branch fallen across the fence line. A trapped animal. Nothing prepared her for the sight beyond the thicket. There, near the edge of the trees, under bowed pine limbs and tangled vines dark with rain. Clementine stood motionless, head bowed toward the ground. Emma's beam flickered over her shoulder, then forward. A stray dog lay huddled in the underbrush. Half-matted fur, muddy paws, one ear torn, and one leg bent at the wrong angle. He whimpered once, then quieted again when the light found him. His eyes reflected green-blue. Desperate, and something else, soft. Emma slowed her breath. Oh, buddy? She took a step forward, but the dog flinched. Clementine, without moving, let out a chuff. Not a bleat, not quite a bark, just something between the two. The dog didn't react to Emma, but he watched Clementine, watched her like she might unfurl safety from her breath. It took time. Emma crouched low, spoke evenly, no sudden movements. Eventually eased forward, hands out, voice calm, promising nothing but gentleness. She wrapped her jacket around him, felt the trembling beneath his ribs. He was light, too light. With slow precision, Emma lifted him. He sagged into her arms, too weak to resist. And Clementine? She turned back once the bundle was secured, and retraced her steps without glancing back. As if her only task had been to find him, and deliver him safely into someone's care. They named him Keeper. No one could explain how Clementine knew he was there, tucked in shadows beyond the edge of noise and storm. No one heard a cry. No tracks led from the forest. Only her. She stood beside his crate that first night, refusing to lie down. Only when he lifted his head and rested it near the bars did she settle, quiet, curling just close enough to be felt, but not touch. It rained fiercely then, but inside, the fire burned steady. And so did Clementine. At first, he barely moved. Wrapped in Emma's softest towels and tucked inside the crate, the dog simply lay still, eyes flicking open only when someone entered the room. He didn't growl, didn't whimper, just watched, as though waiting not to be touched, but to vanish entirely. They named him Keeper. Emma found the name in a dream or maybe in a space between thoughts. It fit, somehow. A dog rescued by a goat in the middle of a windstorm already belonged to stories. Keeper didn't trust easily. When Emma offered food, he wouldn't eat unless Clementine was near. When Dylan coaxed him with bits of leftover turkey, the dog just turned his head. But if Clementine sat beside the crate, her presence alone eased the tension behind his ribs. She didn't fuss over him. She didn't nudge, didn't beg play. She simply waited. On the third morning, something changed. Emma had opened the crate door, knowing he wouldn't come out. Left it gently ajar, just in case. Clementine lay nearby, head resting on her hooves, watching the fireplace. Keeper watched her. Then, slowly, carefully, he inched forward. Not toward food, not toward the dogs who blinked from across the room, but toward her. Toward Clementine. He didn't touch. Just stopped short, settling a foot away with effort that made his shoulders quiver. But she shifted slightly, making space. And they stayed like that. Not together, not apart. In the evenings, Clementine began to guide him. When the other dogs padded toward the back porch, she stood and glanced back to see if Keeper followed. If he hesitated, she took shorter steps until he moved. He wouldn't touch the rug near the fireplace at first. But Clementine would lie there, patient and still. Eventually, he crept close enough to rest a paw across the rug's fringe. That was enough. He didn't try to take Scout's place. Not even once. Tilly, ever exuberant, tried to bounce greetings his way, but he flinched back. Maple offered distant glances and quiet companionship, but never engaged. Emma spoke kindly, kept her movements slow. And Clementine? She never pushed. But she was the first to understand his rhythms. She stood between him and kitchen noise if Dylan dropped a pan. She blocked Tilly playfully when the younger dog got too eager. When lightning arrived one early morning without warning, it was her body keeper pressed against in the silence after the crash. Emma saw it all, quietly, like watching roots grow deeper, unseen but steady. Weeks passed, and the seasons pressed toward frost again. Keeper put on weight, moved with less hesitation. His leg healed in a slow spiral of vet visits and warmth and time. And Clementine stayed beside him. A goat raised by dogs, teaching an injured stray how to live in a pack again. Sometimes, they slept back to back near the warm patch of hearth. Not always, but enough. It wasn't Scout's spot anymore. Clementine had not tried to fill it, and neither did Keeper. Instead, they made a new shape. One defined not by replacing what was lost, but by holding space where quiet love could live in its place. In that house of collared creatures and unspoken understanding, no one said what they all began to feel. That whatever had drawn Clementine into the storm that night hadn't ended there. It had only just begun. Spring softened the edges of the world again. The orchard bloomed in shy pinks and whites, its blossoms shaking loose in the warm breeze like gentle confetti. The pasture glowed green, slippery with new growth, and the river beyond gleamed silver blue in the slant of late morning light. Clementine tread the grass slowly now. She no longer bounded through fields or kicked up her hooves when the dogs raced ahead. Her steps were deliberate, quiet. Hoofprints pressed lightly beside pawprints, and from a distance, it was just as it had always been. Goat and dogs, a strange family in motion. But near, you'd see the change. Her muzzle had grayed a touch. Her joints clicked softly in the hush between birdsong. She still trotted after Emma, still came when called, still tilted her head when a familiar whistle rose across the yard, but slower. Time, it seemed, had crept close again. Keeper walked beside her most days now. He'd grown stronger, settled into the rhythm of the house, gentle and steady. With Clementine, he was especially careful. The bull's rush of youth he might show with Tilly was absent. By her side, he was something else. A shadow. A shield. The three of them, Emma, Clementine, Keeper, often sat on the porch in the lilac light of afternoon. Emma hummed sometimes. Old folk tunes her mother used to sing in the kitchen while the soup simmered and the dogs lay sprawled across cool tiles. Tunes with no words, or ones long forgotten. Clementine would lay at her feet, her head brushing the underside of Emma's hand. If Emma paused, Clementine leaned closer. If Emma cried, though rarely, Clementine pushed her nose softly into the girl's knee. She didn't ask, she only witnessed. The fruit trees began to bear again. Bees returned in dizzy spirals. And one golden day, as the dogs chased each other through dandelions, Clementine stood still by the orchard gate, watching. Emma stood a few feet away, her hands in her pockets, hair braided like her mother used to do on Sundays. When she looked over, Clementine met her gaze. "Still here, huh?" Emma asked softly, not expecting an answer. But Clementine walked to her, pressed her side along Emma's legs. And Emma laughed, a choked, happy sound caught somewhere between memory and relief. They walked back together, slow and unhurried. Inside that evening, Clementine lay by the hearth as the fire cracked into life. Keeper circled once before lying beside her. Emma sat nearby, polishing Scout's old tag, still strung on the wall above the mantel. She held it quietly, then reached into the little box for another, faintly scratched, warm from the fire glow. Clem. Still legible, still loved. She ran her finger over the letters and smiled. "Don't worry," she said, watching the goat lower her head in familiar fashion, curling into that space beside the brickwork. "We'll light the fire for you, too." The wind had teeth again. It bit at the windows, pressed thin howls against the eaves, whispered through the chimney with a voice that remembered other winters. The hawthorn house felt smaller in the cold, walls holding their breath, floorboards creaking sighs from deeper inside the wood. Clementine did not rise for breakfast. She had stirred when the fire was rekindled, had watched with slow, thoughtful eyes as Emma passed through the room, laying a fresh log down, coaxing warmth from still glowing coals. She blinked once, sighed, and settled again. Emma crouched beside her. "Want to go to the barn tonight?" she asked, brushing a hand along Clementine's fleece. "Snow's supposed to come again." But Clementine did not move. Her body curled into a careful shape, limbs tucked just so, the collar around her neck still red but muted in the dim light. The tag didn't clink. It rested silently on her chest. Emma stayed there a while, knee on the rug, hand unmoving. Keeper paced in the hallway, uncertain. Tilly whimpered and retreated. Even Maple, old and graying, stood at a cautious distance and watched. "She always knew," Emma whispered, though to no one. All day, Clementine remained by the hearth. She drank a little water when Emma brought it close, nibbled half an apple slice and let the other half rest untouched. But mostly, she waited. The fireplace did its part. Bright and attentive, it snapped softly toward her, casting ribbons of gold across the rug. Shadows moved slow across her body, rising and falling like tides of remembered days. At dusk, Emma brought her a blanket. Old flannel, torn at the edge. One that used to belong to Scout, preserved in the cedar trunk until now. She sat beside her, just like they had in the early days. Just like that first night in the den. "You don't have to," she said quietly, fingers threaded through the fibers. "But I think it's okay if you do." Night fell in kind-hearted silence. Outside, snow began again. Not a blizzard, not brutal, all exhale and hush. Like the world remembering how to fall asleep. By midnight, the fire had burned low. The logs wore down to glowing bones. The room floated in amber. Clementine breathed one last time, long and slow, like she was giving something back, and then she didn't again. No sound, no struggle, only stillness, only peace. Emma woke before dawn. She came downstairs barefoot, holding her own quiet the way one carries a bowl filled to the brim. She stood in the doorway. And knew. She didn't cry, not at first. Only knelt, placed her hand on Clementine's side, and whispered, "Good girl." Then came the tears. Not wild, not sharp, just like snowfall, soft, unstoppable. Keeper stepped forward, pressed his body beside Emma's without touching the goat. His head tilted low. One paw just brushed the rug's edge. The room held them, grief and gratitude braided together. By morning, the fire had gone out. But the warmth remained. It rained the morning they buried Clementine. Not hard, not bitter. Just a steady drizzle that softened the ground and made the air smell like loam and old bark. The orchard behind the barn was quiet but not still. Amber leaves shifted overhead, whispering their own eulogies. Emma dug the hole herself. Dylan offered. So did a neighbor. But she shook her head, her hands already cradling the shovel like it belonged to the memory and not the chore. The dogs sat nearby, silent companions beneath the plum tree. Maple lay with her head on her paws. Tilly watched every motion. Keeper stood close to Emma, tail still, breath measured. They wrapped Clementine in the same flannel blanket she'd first been swaddled in as a kid. the one Emma had never washed, somewhere between reluctance and reverence. She folded it around her with care, tucking corners like you would for a child falling asleep. They laid her beside Scout, under the apple tree's reaching roots. The ground gave easily, softened by rain and time. Emma didn't say words out loud. Not like in stories. No poem. No speech. Only a quiet hum rose from her chest, tuneless and familiar. The sort of song Clementine used to lie still for on drowsy porch afternoons. Dylan waited a long while before speaking. She was only a goat, he said, too gently to mean it. Emma didn't look up. She wasn't only anything. Afterward, they returned to the house in silence. Inside, the fire had been relit, smaller now, a low burn to dry the damp from their clothes. Emma passed through the den without a word, and went straight to the fireplace. There, above the mantel, hung Scout's collar. And beside it, carefully nailed, brass tag still faintly gleaming, was Clementine's. Clem. No one had told her to hang it there. No one had dared ask if she would. It simply belonged. That night, the house seemed unfamiliar. Not loud. Just missing something that didn't make noise to begin with. The hearthroom still bore the indent where Clementine used to sleep. Her reflection no longer caught in the window glass. Her collar no longer clinked against the tile. Emma sat on the couch, legs drawn up, tea gone cold in her hands. Rain tapped the windows. The fire cracked lower. Keeper circled the room once, whined gently at the hearth, then curled in the hollow beside the rug. He didn't sleep. He just rested there, awake and waiting. Emma stayed up late, past long after the flames gave out and the logs had turned to ash. When she finally stood, her footsteps echoed louder than they should have. But she turned back, just for a moment. Looked toward the hearth, toward Keeper, and whispered, "She still thinks she's ours." No one answered, but in the glow from the last ember, the name on the brass tag flickered once, bright, brief, as though agreeing. Emma had the dream a week after the burial. It came gently, as dreams sometimes do, without thunder, without fanfare. Just a hush in the middle of sleep, a softening of breath, and then she was standing in a golden field that bent like silk under the breeze. The light was the kind that doesn't belong to day or night, just glow. Before her, the grass parted. Scout came first, his run slow but joyful, the way he moved before stiffness claimed his stride. His ears bounced. His tail swayed like it remembered every rhythm it ever danced. And behind him trotted Clementine. She was younger, or perhaps simply whole in a way Emma hadn't seen for years. Her legs strong, her eyes bright, her body lighter as if the world no longer weighed anything at all. She let out that strange, half-bark bleat Emma always thought was pretend, but here, it sounded real. Scout barked once and she echoed it. The meadow stretched on. Around them were hills Emma somehow recognized, though she knew she'd never been there, except in memory. Trees carried the shape of orchard limbs. Wind smelled like the barn. And somewhere, far off, a porch swing creaked, even though there was no porch. Emma didn't speak. She couldn't. But they saw her. Scout trotted near, nuzzled her hand. Clementine pressed her forehead against her leg, a gesture both impossible and perfectly ordinary. And then, without farewell, they turned. They walked into the warmth. Together. No leash. No rope. Just the kind of knowing that needs no asking or staying. The field faded like breath on glass. When Emma woke, there were tears on her cheeks. But no ache. No sting. Just warmth. She sat up slowly, the early light sneaking through the curtain edges. The fire downstairs, long out, seemed to hum in its own quiet way. She rose barefoot and padded toward the hearth. There, the collars still hung. Clem, Scout. Beside the rug, Keeper lifted his head. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He only watched her. Then, as if knowing something unspoken, he turned in a slow circle, and curled on the rug. Right where they used to sleep. Emma knelt nearby, resting her hand on the fringe. The room was still, but not empty, and for a moment, all through the floorboards and stone and walls that had watched so many seasons come and go, something soft moved beneath the silence. As if love had never needed a body in order to stay. They say Clementine was just a goat. That she'd wandered too far from instinct. That she was doted on, indulged, made strange by too much kindness. That animals don't mimic behavior unless rewarded, and that loyalty is the territory of tooth and pack, not hoof and horn. But those who lived in that house, beneath its drafty eaves and scuffed floors, don't say that anymore. They remember the way she paused at doorways like the others. How she lifted her head when keys rattled in the lock. The way she would nudge her bowl when it was mealtime, not out of hunger, but to keep rhythm with her family. And they remember the waiting. Long after Scout was gone, long before Keeper came, Clementine sat vigil at the hearth each night as though she'd been given a watch and a reason, even if no one could name it. Now, time has passed. Winters have come heavy then gone soft again. Tilly's face has gone silver. Keeper stretches slower, but with ease. There are new dogs now. Puppies who paw at doorstops and wrestle at the foot of the stairs. Their collars chime with unfamiliar names. And yet, on their very first night in the house, each one does the same thing. They find the fireplace. They curl in its glow. Some circle, uncertain. Some collapse in a sigh. One nosed at the rug, pawed lightly, then settled his chin as if onto a familiar lap. No one shows them. Not anymore. There are no commands, no habits taught between arrival and ritual. Just something unseen guiding them toward warmth, toward the spot where love once kept watch. Emma still lights the fire every winter evening. Still glances toward the rug as mugs clink softly in her hands. Still lingers by the mantel, fingers brushing the brass tags that hang like bells from memory. Scout. Clem. Sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, her gaze will drift. Not from sadness, not always, but from the softness of remembering. She no longer waits for hoofbeats. But once, at the edge of a long December night, when the fire had burned low and the house held a stillness more full than quiet, she thought she heard something. A single clack on tile. No bark followed, no whine, just that one note, brief, light, as if someone had stepped through the air, just past the reach of waking. She didn't chase the sound. Instead, she smiled, whisper light, and whispered without turning, "I know." And to this day, when the snow falls tight and endless, when tea steams gently on the table and paws stretch toward heat, the room seems full again. Not crowded, complete. And if the fire burns low, even now, sometimes you can hear it. One soft step, not quite paw, not quite hoof, but something true, something still here. The house had grown quieter in the years since Clementine passed, but the quiet never felt empty. Rather, it layered itself into the corners, the floorboards, the softest edges of the fireplace flame. It hummed in the walls, not with silence, but with presence. Emma no longer thought of her in flashes of sadness. There were no sharp edges to the memories now. Only warmth. She could still see her, sometimes in the way Tilly paused by the hearth and looked over her shoulder, as if checking for someone else. In the way Keeper stepped aside when serving dinner, leaving exactly enough room for a goat who was no longer there. Even the new ones, the pups with their oversized paws and wide eyes, respected the rule. The hearth was not just a place to rest. It was a place to remember. One stormy afternoon, a woman arrived at the farm carrying a soaking wet border collie pup in her jacket. "Found him at the edge of town," she said, curled up near a drainage pipe, shivering and alone. "No collar, no microchip. He ran," she added, like he knew the road was wrong, and this was where he was supposed to be. Emma hadn't planned on another. But when she brought the pup inside and dried him by the hearth, he crawled forward, awkward and half-startled, and folded against the rug like he was coming back to something he couldn't name. Tilly lifted her snout. Keeper heaved a sigh. The new pup looked around, then leaned his head against nothing and slept. Later, when Emma returned with a collar and tag, something about the moment made her pause. She scratched the name onto the brass herself. Simple lines, small letters. When night came and the fire was lit, she sat near the rug in the same spot she always had. Her tea sat cooling beside her knee. Outside, the wind curled across the glass. The new pup stirred in his sleep, one paw twitching. And in a pocket of silence between the pops of settling wood, she spoke. "You're not replacing anyone, you're just continuing something." The firelight touched her cheek, turned silver strands in her hair gold again. She didn't cry, not because the ache had gone, but because the ache had bloomed into something else. Around her, the house sighed into sleep. Books remained open, boots stayed by the door. The bowl of water reflected glints of the flame. And on the hearth rug, 3 collars gleamed. Scout, Clem, Keeper. The new pup would have his place, in time. Not instead of, alongside. Because love didn't vanish. It layered. Emma leaned back into the armchair, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and let her eyes settle shut. If she dreamed, she wouldn't remember the details. Only the sound, a soft breath, a careful step, familiar, close, and still, impossibly, here. The first snow of that winter came sudden, soft as breath, and thick enough to turn the windows to milk glass by afternoon. The farmhouse sighed beneath its weight, roof lines blurred, chimney breathing out warmth in gentle spirals. Inside, the fire hummed steadily. Its glow filled the room like a voice, wrapping around corners and deeper memories. Emma found herself doing small things she hadn't done in years. Tucking flannel under the rug to stop it curling. Resorting the tag drawer, the one where old collars slept. Dusting picture frames that didn't need it. She didn't think of Clementine during these motions, not consciously, but the awareness surfaced anyway. Not as images, as feelings, as habit that remembered without asking. By the end of the week, the snow had sealed the driveway in quiet. Dylan texted. "Roads iced. Stay put." Emma just replied with a photo of the fire and a mug in hand. Planned on it. The dogs welcomed the slowness. Keeper lay beside the hearth with his limbs stretched long along the rug, breathing in rhythm with the log's pop and sigh. Tilly had wedged herself half under an armchair, tail flicking in dreams. And the new pup, still nameless, still soft with youth, had found his place. He followed Emma more than food. Waited beside the bathroom door. Barked only once, when a shadow startled him, and then sat guilty in the silence after. He had a strange sort of stillness when it mattered most. Unlike Tilly, who buzzed through life, or Keeper, who wore caution like a faded coat. The pup stopped when the fire cracked in a certain way. When Emma hummed to herself in the kitchen. When the wind touched the chimney just so. He'd tilt his head, just slightly, as if hearing something beyond the distraction of now. That evening, Emma filled the kettle and passed without thinking through the den. But her steps slowed. The pup was curled in the dead center of the hearth rug, gazing at the mantel. Not sleeping, not alert, just present. His body had settled into the same shape Clementine once made. Same fold of the haunch. Same curl of tail to flank. As if some knowledge passed from fibers to flesh. Not taught, not even remembered, just inherited. She didn't speak, only watched. Then, as if sensing her gaze, the pup turned and looked at her. Not startled, not expectant, simply seeing, and she smiled without meaning to. Later, after dinner and dishes and the slow work of winter nights, she added another tag to the drawer. Just one, blank for now. They'd name him eventually, but tonight, she lit the fire again. Sat in her usual chair, pulled the flannel blanket up and sipped slow from the chipped mug with the faded bluebirds on it. The dogs exhaled their weight into the floor. The clock ticked in layered hush. And on the rug, the pup sighed once, settled deeper, and didn't move again until morning. The fire had burned low again, nearing its sigh. The place between light and ash, where everything flickers but nothing quite dies. The room leaned gently into darkness, walls wrapped in amber hush, and the rug by the hearth still carried the shape of sleep, even long after the dogs stirred away. Emma sat nearby, unmoving. The book in her lap sat open, not read. She wasn't watching the page. Her eyes had drifted, past sentence and meaning, past the mantel's chipped edge, drawn to the fire's rhythm the way one listens to remembered songs. The pup had fallen asleep hours earlier, his tiny snore lost beneath the fire's soft crack. He'd curled into the center of the rug, his nose tucked under one paw, his back to the blaze. He didn't twitch in dreams, not outwardly. But every so often, his ears flicked toward unseen things. Scents or shadows. Something the others no longer noticed. Emma blinked. The book slid closed in her hands. And then, just as she leaned forward to add a log, the pup raised his head. Not startled, not fully awake, just lifted, eyes half open. He turned toward the hearth, toward nothing Emma could see, and wagged his tail, slow, uncertain, once. It wasn't a greeting, not exactly, more like recognition. The fire flared softly, as embers shifted under the new shape of air. No draft, no sound, just heat leaning in, carrying a sense that someone else had entered, though no doors had moved. The pup laid his chin back down, eyes never leaving that empty space by the brick. Emma didn't say a word, only leaned back, let the log settle into place. Let the warmth gather again, loosening the chill from her knuckles. She remembered the way Clementine used to sit just like that, head tilted, ears forward, body listening more than watching. That posture was here again. No imitation, just remembrance finding another form. The pup blinked, yawned. His body shifted, this time closer to Keeper, whose steady breathing never changed. Tilly whined in her sleep, rolled over, and pressed into the space beside the rug, fur brushing old threads. Emma stood quietly and crossed the room. She stopped by the mantel, ran her fingers gently over the brass tags. One by one, not picking them up, just touching. Scout, Clem, Keeper. Then she opened the top drawer of the little side table and pulled out the blank tag. She turned it slowly in the firelight. How long before you earn one? She said softly, more to herself than not. The pup didn't stir, but the rug beneath him seemed to shift in that subtle way it always had. Like threads knowing they were part of something larger. Emma sat back down, the tag resting in her palm. And the fire, as if content now, settled into its rhythm again. Outside, snow tapped gently against glass. Inside, the warmth was more than heat. It was memory, loyalty, the miracle of an ordinary evening exact in its quiet, and somehow, perfectly, complete. That winter lingered longer than most. Even by late February, the mornings arrived heavy with frost, and evening shadows stretched earlier, darker. The trees stood bare, skeletal against the pewter sky, and the hills beyond the pasture disappeared behind curtains of slow-moving fog. Inside the farmhouse, the fire took on a rhythm of its own, built at sunrise, rekindled at dusk. It spoke in hisses and gentle pops, always meeting the cold with something softer. The rug before the hearth, worn now as an old photograph, still carried the outlines of curled bodies, faint depressions like ghostly footprints that refused to fade. The nameless pup had started sleeping with his back to the fire. Not indifference, trust. As if he knew its warmth would never falter. Emma had taken to calling him, maybe, not out loud, but in her head. Maybe Charlie, maybe Finn, maybe Chance. She wasn't quite ready to choose. But he was already answering to something. He rose now when she entered the room, not with the bounding energy of Tilly, but with still grace. He walked beside her to the kitchen, tilted his head at the sound of the kettle, came when called, not out of obedience, but awareness. Like he had heard this all before, in another time. Under different names. Keeper, older, steadier, followed less often now. His joints spoke in soft resistance, but his eyes never left the pup. They moved like moons in orbit, one casting the path, the other learning its light. It was during one quiet afternoon, the kind when wind speaks in branches and floors stretch in settling sighs, that Emma pulled a small box from the top shelf of the hallway cabinet. She brought it to the den floor, laid it gently between her and the pup, opened the lid. Inside, a single brass tag, blank. A length of leather collar, softened by decades but waiting, somehow, for its next shape. The pup sniffed the box, then looked up at her. Emma smiled. "You've always been here, haven't you?" He didn't respond, but he stayed near. She turned the tag over in her fingers, pressed her thumb into its center. "Scout didn't need a name to be loyal," she said softly. "Clem didn't need words to belong. You already shine in the places they left for you." The pup lowered to the rug without breaking her gaze. She set the tag beside his paw. Light caught it, plain, unwritten. And yet it gleamed like it knew what it would soon spell. Emma didn't fasten it yet. Didn't trace the letters with her carving tool. But she whispered one name. A test. A trying of weight. And the pup's tail thumped, once. She laughed then, soft and sudden. The others stirred, Keeper lifting his head, Tilly groaning from a dream, and then settled again. Outside, snow began to fall, thin, slow, ordinary. Inside, the name had not yet been written. But it lived now, in the glow, in the air, in the space by the hearth where love makes room not for what was, but for what waits to become. Morning light arrived without asking, low, golden, soft enough to forgive the cold still lodged in the windows. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, leaving behind a hush so complete that even the ticking clock seemed reluctant to speak too loudly. Emma awoke to silence, but it wasn't emptiness. It was the kind of silence that cups things carefully, that remembers without breaking, that breathes. She came downstairs still wrapped in sleep, her hair loose, sweater trailing her wrists. The kettle hadn't boiled yet. The fire hadn't been stirred. But the den was already full. Tilly lay curled in the chair, dreams twitching across her paws. Keeper stretched beside the hearth, nose tucked just beneath one leg. The pup, still not quite named but entirely known, sat alone in the center of the rug, facing the fire as if listening to something only he could hear. He didn't look up until she sat beside him. Then he leaned his weight, just slightly, against her leg and let out a long, quiet sigh. "Good morning," she whispered. She reached into her pocket, and from it pulled a tag, no longer blank. Brass, warm from her touch. Letters newly carved, clear and steady. Around it curled a collar stitched with care. Soft leather, the color of clover bark and ash. She held it near, showed him slowly. The name gleamed. He sniffed it, looked at her again. And then, without a word, stepped forward. Emma fastened it gently around his neck, the way she had done twice before. Once for a goat who dreamed of dogs. Once for a dog who'd already been found. It clicked into place. Outside, the snow began to melt in threads of silver, droplets trailing down the windows. The trees stood motionless, holding the weight of brightening sky across their limbs. Inside, the pup stepped onto the rug again, this time curling on the left side of the hearth, where no one had ever claimed a place before. Emma settled back. Above her, the mantle held its own quiet memory: Scout, Clem, Keeper. Below it, the newly added tag caught the firelight. 4 names now, none outshining the others, all lined like notes in a quiet melody. She reached for her tea, no longer hot, but comforting. The fire flared softly, and in that room, not large, not loud, a familiar shape returned. Not as a ghost, not as memory, but as continuation, the kind that lives not in endings, but in space made sacred by who once lay there and who, heart open, chooses to stay.